Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for attending what will be the last day of this virtual Spring Summit. I'm Susanna Bourne, Managing Director of Antares Relocation, based in sunny Spain, and Vice President for EuRA. Before I start, I do want to let you know that the last session for today is called Until We Meet Again with the Board. And in the true EuRA style, we will have a drink to hand. So please ensure that if you wish to join us, you can get yours too. So firstly, I wanted to thank the sponsor of the day. Thank you, Dwellworks, for your great generosity throughout all these years as a recurring sponsor.
Hey everybody, from Cleveland, Ohio, Dwellworks headquarters. This is Bob Rosing, CEO of Dwellworks, and just here to say hello and touch base with everybody. As we come into the middle part of spring and head towards summer, we're starting to see some green shoots and some light at the end of the tunnel, with vaccines being proliferated, with travel starting to pick up, and with new order volumes actually starting to show some signs of encouragement. Hopefully that'll sustain us through the summer, into the fall, and beyond. Hats off to Tad, Dom, Francis, Michelle, the rest of the EuRA gang. Terrific job these last 2 weeks on the conference, and great content. The whole list of topics to include sustainability and so forth make us smarter, stronger, and better as we come out of this. And so I think we all learned a lot the last couple of weeks, and hats off again to all of you. So on behalf of the Dwellworks team around the world, cheers to all of you around the world. Stay well, see you soon, and take care. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you, Bob, for your words. I agree with you fully. Green shoots and finally light at the end of the tunnel. In the past, Dwellworks has always sponsored the superb gala dinner that we've all so much enjoyed and have fun memories of. All things being equal, I know Dwellworks will be sponsoring the next gala dinner in Seville, which has already been postponed 3 times, and which I foresee will be rated amongst the best gala dinners ever. So can't wait to get there next year. As we have all mentioned, we're very grateful to our sponsors, because without you, these summits, talks, and other activities that EuRA put on throughout the year would simply not be possible. So without further ado, it is my honor to welcome Alistair Murray, hosting what I think is a very important session in order to better understand the RMC RFP process, giving us an insight into the world involved in them winning new clients. Alistair, pull back those curtains and let us see what goes on backstage with the RMC RFP process.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susanna. Lovely introduction, and thank you to Dwellworks. Hi, everybody. I'm Alistair from Packinpex, aka Not Him Again. I'm on your screens again as of yesterday as well, and today, slightly different topic. We're covering the RMC RFP process. So if you wonder how long it will take, and the cost and the time involved in an RMC to win a new lucrative client, we're going to go through the steps of the process today and talk through a little bit about what's involved. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel, a fantastic panel of experts. Firstly, we have Gemma. Gemma's the manager of Supplier Networks EMEA for BGRS. Hi, Gemma.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Alistair.
Hi. Next, we have Andreas, VP of EMEA for Wykert.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Andreas. And then last but not least, we have Brian, Managing Director of EMEA for Nomad.
Hi, everybody.
So Brian, particular interest today for some of the things you're going to add to the discussion, Brian, with various different hats, metaphorical hats that you'll be wearing throughout the discussion. So yeah, looking forward to the input from all 3 of you. Okay, so I think, as we've discussed amongst the group, I think one of our challenges today will be getting through a huge amount of information in a relatively short space of time. So let's start, Andreas, with you, if I may. I appreciate that some of the prospective clients that you're looking to work with in the future may have a sales cycle of 3, maybe 5 years, and your role for a good portion of that time is to build up a relationship with those clients when they're not looking to change provider for a long time. So could you maybe talk through what's involved in that process and how you manage to stay in touch with somebody for such a length of time?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, one of the things that sales cycle can be extremely long, can be up to 6 years, as you mentioned, obviously can be a lot shorter as well. It depends on where the client or where the prospective client is in their finding process, if you like, of what they want to do. Have they only just signed with a provider, and are they just not wanting to hear anything from any RMC for the next 4 years? Or are they interested in listening what's going on in the marketplace? What kind of services are other providers offering that my provider might not be offering in this shape and form that I would be hoping for? But to start with, I would say, if you would have asked me a year and a half ago if it was possible to sell virtually, I would have categorically told you there's no way that we would be able to sell a really complex service to an organization via Zoom calls. Well, I was wrong. You can, and it works, and it is interesting. It's changed a lot through the COVID situation, through working from home. It's easier sometimes to get in front of people, but you don't get an hour. You might get 15 or 30 minutes, and it's become a little bit more challenging. I mean, the ideal world for me as a business development individual is that when I get an RFP and I work on it and I respond, my ideal world is that the person who reads that RFP response merely gets a confirmation about what they know of us already anyway. Now, this is a great ideal world, which never really happens that way, but it's my job to get as close to that as possible. And how do we do that? We do face-to-face meetings. We do, well, face-to-face if we can, or obviously as much screen time as we can. We try to introduce colleagues. We try to introduce the organization. We try to understand where the pain points of the prospect are, because I don't know if it was ever the case that in our mobility world you could be the typical salesperson, show up with shiny shoes and tell them what great stuff you've got and you make the deal. It's a far more complex process. The organization trusts you with their greatest assets, with their colleagues, and trying to get them from A to B. So, you know, we, as much as the client, needs to thoroughly understand what we have to offer, and we have to understand what they're looking for, because in that process it could turn out that we're the wrong partner. It could turn out that we don't actually want to work for that client because they have requirements that we cannot or do not want to meet. So that's kind of and this can take, again, as you said, between a year and 6 years. I think the longest turnaround that I've had from first contract to actual signing was about 10 years, but that's because I didn't win it twice, and the third time I did. So
okay, persistence paid off.
So absolutely. I mean, you have to be prepared to walk away as well. I know this is something where I think organizations need to be brave and need to ask the questions that you need to ask. What are your requirements? And if they're critical for you, or if they seem to be unmanageable for you, find out if they're deal breakers. I think, and especially with the audience on this presentation, I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to waste the prospect's time, and I don't want to waste the time of the supply chain and we've all seen these tedious spreadsheets that we sometimes get where we have to fill out forms and numbers, and it's hard work. It is, and sometimes you'd rather put needles in your eyes than do a single additional number. It is painful, but it's just part of the process. And if you can avoid it because you know there's no way in hell you're going to win it anyway, I think you should be brave and ask the question, and if it's necessary, walk away. Bit of criticism, I guess, and we all do that sometimes. We kind of think, oh, let's worry about that later. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, and we'll be so far ahead. They're not gonna walk back just because of this tiny little thing. That's not good for our reputation, that kind of approach. I think the honesty up front is the best way forward.
Absolutely, thank you. I find that really interesting. I have so many potential follow-up questions, but I'm going to try and limit them to one or two. So clearly, key stakeholders in the process are obviously the mobility team or the HR team, but also procurement in an RFP process. Do you ever get to speak to procurement before a bid, or is that just somebody that's almost unobtainable until we're coming to sort of contract negotiation time?
Sometimes it depends on the organization. Some organizations, and I've been in the industry for a while, I've seen the same procurement individual over and over again. So as I know them, I can address them and I can see if I can talk to them. But on the other hand, procurement for a huge organization, what I've seen very often is they don't know who the procurement person is. They decide on the person at the very end. And in some cases, they will put the most junior person they can find on this RFP, because even if it's a big client, 200 million spend for an organization that buys billions, well, let the new guy see what he can do. And then those are the guys who come up and say, can we negotiate council tax? It's a very difficult process sometimes when you get people who do not understand the industry and that you have not had the chance to speak to, because what we try to do is I'm sure I speak for every single one of my colleagues, is we try to educate them on what we're really doing, that we're not buying commodities, we're not buying pencils, that if the first round of pencils doesn't work, it's an insurance case and tough luck, let's try it again. But we don't do that. We look after, as I said before, the company's most valuable asset. And I don't think there's you get these things like when you get the RFP, you get asked for quotes for things like, my worst one was ever a pet global. They want one rate for shipping a pet globally. It doesn't matter from where to where. When you get that RFP, you clearly did not do your job and educate the procurement person, because as we all know, that's pretty impossible. So we try, but it's sometimes very difficult.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So if we have built that relationship in this theoretical process we're talking through, and we're now completing the RFP, Brian, I'd like to bring you in at this stage, if I may. Not everybody watching this will know the role you did previously before Nomad at GSK, and heavily involved in a mobility RFP process. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience in that role, particularly when it comes to pulling together the RFP, and then we'll get the feedback from the other two on the other side of completing it.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, it was an interesting situation from my perspective, having a mobility background and going into a procurement world, which was, as kind of Andreas said, it's, I'm sitting around people that are selling pencils, pens, and kind of tangible things like that. When you kind of talk then about customer service, it's very difficult then to educate your procurement colleagues kind of like the value of kind of what mobility is about. And so I spent a lot of time actually educating the procurement, like people that I reported into, kind of what mobility was. So there was the balance of that, also then the balance of working with the mobility team in itself, which, there's competing factors, right? From a procurement perspective, it's usually a lot about obviously pricing and kind of driving down the best rate. And then obviously you got the mobility perspective, which is a lot more around kind of the service delivery and how they work and how they're working with their current RMC today and how the technology works and kind of the value of that. So trying to mesh the two together is extremely difficult. I had so many different types of meetings with all levels across, whether procurement, whether HR business leaders, whether it was the mobility team, from the mobility director down to the consultants that are dealing with the RMC day to day. And it was tough. I felt like I was educating everyone every single day. And you'd think, like, for the amount of spend that a corporate is putting into this every single day, you'd hope that someone had a bit more of a cotton on idea. But I think the challenge is, particularly from a procurement perspective, is we'll have a mobility category manager who will be on that maybe for 6 to 12 months, and then they'll roll off onto something else. It could well be when I was at GSK, we had people moving on to higher spending categories, so like fleet management or kind of like vaccine management. And so kind of when you've done that, you then move on to the next one. So it was interesting to hear Andreas say that he's seen procurement people again and again, which is great, because I was trying to find people that had done it before, because, you know, for me, I'd never written a global RFP before. So I was chatting to obviously a lot of my peers at a lot of the other corporates to find out what their experiences was, how they did it, because there isn't like a here's how to write an RFP guide out there that is tailored to. So I spoke to a lot of our, as I say, kind of other pharmaceutical companies, as well as a lot of the RMCs, really just to kind of get guidance.
Right.
So that kind of collaborative nature was extremely important.
Excellent. And so were there, Brian, without giving anything away too confidential, were there people in your team who were tasked with or targeted to reduce the overall spend? Was that a goal in place? Were you looking at it in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think for every procurement department, it's kind of like the be and end all, really. If you're not providing some sort of cost saving, you're not doing your job from a procurement perspective. And that's kind of where the delicate balance of really understanding what mobility is about versus kind of like what procurement's there for. And so the educational side of things was interesting, particularly when the procurement understood that from an RMC perspective, the management fees, let's say, is what, 1 to 3%, let's say, of the overall spend, and then the pass-through fees of obviously DSP, temporary housing, household goods, all of that, they couldn't quite understand. So it's like trying to drill down on the management fees. It's like, that's not the area that you need to be looking at. And so that's why I think kind of why you have such a long RFP process, particularly from a pricing grid perspective, because you have literally every shipping lane under the sun, every temporary housing, and so they try to find like the areas as much as they can where they can save obviously some money and then report that back to finance and claim that as a saving.
Yeah, and if I may sort of jump in on that point, I think it's not necessarily always about the lower cost either. And I think sometimes if you do have a kind of client where the procurement and global mobility sort of relationship is not necessarily as close as you might think it would be. I think a lot of the value add elements that are not necessarily cost based can get lost in the sort of the nitty gritty RFP process. It's very difficult to put on paper all of the other added value items that an RMC and its network bring to the table. All of the information, all of the tailoring of documentation, the fact that we partner with our clients very, very closely in developing certain elements that come, during the life cycle of the contract. I think all of those other elements, are not necessarily something that is black and white on the paper and can be discussed clearly with procurement. If it is just that bottom line that they're looking at in their management fees, as Brian mentioned before. So again, I think sort of bringing those additional elements to the fore is a real important part of the RFP. It's not just what is on that paper, it's what else we can bring to the table. And again, I think that's why it's really important that we do have client RFPs and we're completing them and they're written by people who essentially know what they're delivering. And I think it's quite clear that that's not necessarily always the case. And I think that's when those RFPs and sort of supplementary work down the line becomes very, very challenging. It's not, buying a pen, it's a service. And that's very difficult and again, very challenging to sort of, I think, sometimes score and mark sort of side by side. It's not necessarily all about tangible or the bottom line.
I sometimes wish I could be there when procurement compares pricing, because you can very often you can very often see that you get scenarios, let's say, for instance, and they want a bottom line, but in these scenarios they have different options and they add them all together. So you have the option, let's just say for argument's sake, a 1 day, a 2 day, a 3 day program. And you have to put in a cost for a 1 day, a 2 day, a 3 day program, and they add them all together, and then think, whoa, relocation is expensive. But no, you either do a 1 or a 2 or a 3 day. So, and I'm sometimes very curious of the validity of the result from a pricing point of view, because Brian, exactly what you said. When you have to go in really minute detail trying to explain what the cost is for what. You don't have that in very many organizations, that people really make that effort like you did. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can almost hear the sound of service providers around the world pulling their hair out at the moment. So if you're reacting to that in some way, or you're interested in that, and you have comments or questions, then I didn't mention at the start, but please feel free to add questions on the EuRA app, and I'll do my best to bring those in towards the end of the discussion. One other point, Gemma, for you, when we are, again, in this theoretical process, completing the RFP, are you going out to your supplier network? Do you get input at that stage from your suppliers or partners, or is that already something you have available to you?
I think we try. It depends on the individual RFP, and I think they're all very, very different in terms of kind of what they're looking for. I think we at BGRS try very hard to keep our network away from, I think, some of the challenges that naturally occur sort of during the implementation process. It could be that we have to reach out to them to ask sort of specific questions, information, but again, that's sort of part of that implementation process, and I think that kind of comes in later. I think sometimes we do need to bring in and rely on our network's knowledge. Sometimes it is about understanding a little bit more behind what that client question is about. So yes and no. I think it very much depends on the situation and how valuable it would be to the end goal to sort of bring that in. I mean, we try and as best we can kind of just keep that process ring fence within BGRS so that sort of by the time it gets to the end process, we deliver the client training to the network, and sort of they're none the wiser about the complexity of the process that's just followed.
Yeah. Okay.
And maybe if I can add just one thing. I mean, we all have agreed rates with our supplier network, and just like you said, Gemma, what I think most of us do or try to do is for every single RFP go back and say, now we need a really special rate. We try to stay away from that, but of course, if an RFP comes in with a significant volume into one special location, we'd be stupid not to go to the supply chain and say, guys, is there anything we can do? And of course we do that. But on the standard, let me just use an example. For instance, you got, I don't know, 5 moves into 20 different locations. We have, that's why we negotiated rates in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I've been on the other side of that conversation too, where RMCs have come to me and said, oh, can we have your best fees, please? And I'll always say, you have our best fees. And the reply is generally, can we have your best fees, please? But yeah, I take the point that it may be for a specific requirement. So, okay, in our theoretical RFP process, you've now reached the best and final presentation. So congratulations. Can you talk through a little bit about who's involved, Andreas, and the preparation and how that all comes together? And then maybe I'll come to you, Brian.
Sure. Who's involved is very often very much dependent on the client's agenda that they normally give us. Given is procurement and mobility. Sometimes there's HR involved, legal could be involved, finance could be involved, outside consultants can be involved. That's something that I personally always find a little bit difficult when people from a complete different company join in because they did some advice on the RFP, but that's something we're all grown up, we have to live with. But so it depends on the agenda. From a Weichert point of view, or from a Weichert point of view, what we do is obviously sales and an account management team or an individual that we propose. But also it depends on the agenda. It could be our tax guys. It could be our somebody from supply chain management. It could be somebody from implementation, IT, billing. It all depends on the complexity. And then if it makes sense and the NDA allows us, what I like to do is maybe bring the supply chain. In some cases, okay. I feel that is because yes, we as the RMC. We coordinate, we provide the technology, we provide the legal kind of platform, if you like. But at the end of the day, it's our colleagues in location that have the contact with the transferee and show them around. And so to showcase our supply chain and to show what incredibly talented people we work with can make a huge difference. And I like that because it just shows the entire picture.
I think that's a really good point, Andreas, because as part of the kind of the best and final process which we went through, I really wanted to hit home on that point, in the sense of, you know, you've had the sales pitch, you've had all kind of, you've dotted the I's, crossed the T's, etc., etc. But you really wanted to hear from the people on the ground that actually do the work, and hear it from the consultants of how they actually do it, and provide, you know, scenarios in sense of real life scenarios that say that the company had been through, for the consultants to obviously prepare, but for them to really speak about it, because those are the people at the end of the day that the mobility consultants at the corporate are going to be dealing with at the RMC. So I think that for me was really powerful, just to kind of ensure that you have that, you know, I guess kind of like line of knowledge, because it's great hearing it from the salesperson that comes in and says you can do X, Y, and Z. But it's like actually hearing it from the people that are picking up the phone, speaking to their partners on the ground in certain location, understanding the policy, understanding the complexity. So for me, that was something which was really important.
And to add on to that, something that I've recently, and I don't know if you guys or Gemma, if you've seen any of that recently, I've had a few opportunities where a prospective client asked me for supplier references. They want to speak to our supply chain and interview them. What's it like working with them or them? And I, you know, fingers crossed that goes well. But you know, I feel very confident in that, because that again shows that the buyers are slightly more educated these days to actually do that.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I think it is also about understanding, you know, company culture and what you're buying into in terms of sort of what Brian was saying. And I think those more holistic elements, getting supplier references, I think the interest in sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion matters will certainly become more important, and I think they will feature more heavily in RFPs in the future. I think perhaps historically they've been more of a sort of simple checkbox, but I think global mobility and talent mobility is moving towards realigning themselves much closer with those elements and the corporate social responsibility element. And I think how that effectively moves down through that supply chain to the RMC and down to the network is probably going to be more important. And I think we're going to start to see more need for evidence of how that works in a cohesive and sort of strong manner. So I think it'd be interesting to see sort of how we can help our clients sort of with their own targets in those areas. And I think that interest is just going to continue to filter down. And I think we're definitely likely to see more of what you were just talking about there, Andreas.
I think that's a really good point. And I think in the last couple of weeks of the various sessions have been part of this summit. I think one of my favorite was the sustainability one, actually. I thought that was really inspiring to think of what we can all do a little bit more to protect the planet. And clearly it's not sort of ticking the box anymore. So I guess you're already seeing that, the three of you, in the RFP process, that it's more of a priority. And I completely understand that you'll want to be, you know, challenging your supplier network and asking them what they're doing. Are there things from an RMC perspective as well that you're looking to do within your organization to become more sustainable? Are there things you can do? I don't know, Gemma, do you want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I think at least BDRS itself are really passionate about, and we've been looking at ways for a long time around how we can help support that, whether that's sort of, you know, internal elements around more sort of flexible working. We have a sustainability team within our own office. I think our own office actually is carbon neutral, and even if it's just sort of small little steps towards making a difference, such as, you know, encouraging staff to cycle to work, and little things like that, which obviously we're looking at replicating on a global scale. I do think we need to get better at obtaining quantifiable data so that we can in turn report that back to clients. We started looking at CO2 emissions and getting that data from our suppliers. So I can say for client X, this is what your CO2 emissions are in regards to your policy. And we're definitely seeing much more interest in those types of facts and figures, because ultimately that's going to play into our our corporate clients' own initiatives, and that very much sits, I think, these days at the top of their board agenda. So we're doing what we can in terms of promoting those ideas, and whether it's the use of Ecosia as a website. They plant trees with every single hit on their website. Just sort of even those small steps is something we're taking a good long look at ourselves to try and ensure that we're doing everything that we can within our own business first and foremost. And then, of course, we'll start to look at that in terms of the wider network as well. So I think that's definitely going to be something that we see more and more in terms of importance, and that's going to come through in future RFPs, absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, very good. And Brian, to you, so again, back in your GSK days, was that a priority for the team at the time to look for diverse suppliers and inclusive suppliers? Was that something that was a priority?
Yeah, for sure. And it's, it was one of those things that I think, as Gemma rightly said, it kind of used to be one of those things that you would put on there just to kind of make sure that it was kind of ticked, and then you kind of move on. When I was writing it, it was certainly something which was kind of really at the forefront. We're wanting to actually have, substantiated answers, but also, to Gemma's point before as well, kind of getting the quantifiable data behind that is difficult. And like me as a supplier hat on, like from a temporary housing perspective, it's difficult to kind of really be able to say, all right, so we do this, and this, that actually makes a huge difference. Obviously, there's consideration that's going behind that. And I think there's a lot more that collectively from a service perspective that we can do. And I think, if anything, that we're going to have to do, because this is going to be something which is going to keep coming. So there'll have to be answers that so there's going to be solutions to these answers that we're going to have to create. So it's one of those things which we really kind of need to get our head on if you haven't done it already.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Very good. And I just kind of going back a little bit, Brian, I have another question for you, if that's okay, because I am fascinated by the whole experience of being on the other side of this discussion with GSK. So when you were going through the process of organising the best and final, tell me if I'm overstepping the mark because you're smiling. When you were going through the best and final preparation, and then you were evaluating different suppliers, I think it's a great point that a couple of you made, that you want to have operational people in the process, and not all operational people are not always comfortable or confident presenting in a room full of people. I think Andreas has probably done a lot of best and final presentations over the years, but some people, their forte is customer service and looking after a caseload and managing transferees, not necessarily presenting in a room with lots of scary people and a big screen. So how do you reconcile that and want to hear from people whose forte is not presenting?
So yeah, it's certainly an interesting one for a not present. Are you specifically asking about the internal GSK individual? Or are you asking? Okay, yeah. So I mean, it was an interesting dynamic, particularly between from a procurement perspective, mobility, as well as the HR business leaders. And I'll be honest, trying to get individuals to be a part of the overall process was a challenge in itself, because it's a huge commitment to do it. You're talking about reviewing the RFI, RFP, and then best and final, and all the evaluation that goes along with that, which can take forever. And obviously they've got the day-to-day job to be doing. But as part of the kind of I guess the putting together and putting the mechanics of the best and final presentation, it was hard. Like the mobility team have their, they're still moving people day to day. They're still having their challenges day to day, and making sure that, that what we're doing is something which is not something which you want to do every day. That's for sure. I think anyone's ever written an RFP or gone through the process is certainly not something which you'd want to do every single day. So in terms of kind of coordinating that internally and making sure that we're all, let's say, shooting in the same direction was really tough. A lot of steering meetings, a lot of kind of discussions around obviously waiting for scorecarding, a lot of discussions about what's going to be specifically in the actual RFP, as well as best and final. And then kind of subsequently after that, having the discussions around the evaluation of that. And it's interesting, because obviously you have the objective nature of obviously the finance and kind of what the weighting is behind that, and then you have and to me, to me personally, kind of more important, the kind of the customer service element and kind of how that scored, and that's obviously very much a subjective element. So then meshing all of that together to try and come to a solution. You may have your hierarchy of 1, 2, and 3, but it doesn't necessarily mean when you all sit around the table that's the 1, 2, and 3 that you all would actually think would kind of be the actual result. So it was certainly interesting kind of seeing that whole thing kind of play out after kind of, as I say, getting the results back from from a procurement perspective, providing the results and presenting that to the team versus kind of what the overall group analysis was, because that's certainly changed.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Okay, that's good. It's good to know that it was such a thorough and in-depth process.
Okay. No, I just wanted to say one thing when you say, what you can score really neutrally and what more the softer aspects of it. My experience is when you lose an RFP, it's because of something technical or you don't have an office in XYZ. Or if you win something, it's we really like you guys. It's funny because not all the time, but very, very often that's the kind of feedback that we get, that the deciding factor at the end of the day, with all the metrics and all the great kind of scoring headaches that you had to go through, it's the gut feeling that plays probably the biggest role.
Yeah. And Andreas, on that point, when we've reached this stage of the process and you've received feedback from some of your prospects to say, actually, we've decided to stick with the incumbent or whatever the decision may be, do you sometimes internally discuss that maybe, and this was mentioned on the app, I think a couple of days ago, do you think some tenders are won before they've started? So do you think some are just an exercise in benchmarking where there's no intention of changing?
Absolutely. Some are more comprehensive and they still want to stick with incumbent and they have to go through the procurement process because that's their internal rules and regulations. Sometimes they make it completely obvious to you that when you only get an Excel spreadsheet and are asked to put in rates, and that is the entire RFP, you might as well just forget about it and just say thank you, but no thank you. From an account management point of view, hooray, that's really great because that's a way to keep your client. From a business development point of view, it can be extremely frustrating because it's a huge amount of time, money, effort, and favors almost that you put into an RFP response. We spoke about the long turnaround time or the prospecting time. It gets very frustrating when it comes to that. But my clear answer is yes, you see that, and I wouldn't put a percentage on it, but yes, you see it. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so let's continue with the process. So if we're saying that on this particular theoretical process, it's not just a benchmarking exercise and a new provider has been chosen, I'd just be interested to get your take and your input from the three of you really on that contract negotiation element and whether there sometimes have been clauses. Again, this is another session that's come up in the summit, I think last week, or maybe earlier this week, talking about compliance and about clauses in contracts. Have you seen clauses in certain contracts you've been signing with large multinational companies where they've either been a deal breaker or they've been difficult to reconcile? Maybe Brian, if we start with you.
Yeah. So we had a completely separate. It was interesting. Just for a second, from a legal perspective, we basically had to pitch to our legal team to kind of explain to them what mobility was about and for them to really understand what the process was. So that in itself was, interesting to kind of really for them to understand the granular detail of what the contract that they're actually looking at. So that actually took some time to do that. But kind of like deal breakers, we had a data security team that would, spend ages looking at stuff that's far more complicated than I could possibly ever speak about. And that went on for a considerable amount of time. Additional things, credit checks, obviously the amount of money that kind of goes through these large organizations, whether the RMC can actually fund it for that amount, how long they can actually fund it for, are they financially stable? So that went on for a considerable amount of time as well. And I'm sure Gemma and Andreas would be able to say this, but I've certainly seen it, that whilst the contract negotiations are going on, business still needs to keep going. People still need to keep moving. So we have instances whereby you receive moves, but the contract hasn't yet been signed. So it's kind of like you're in that weird grey area. So I'd say predominantly it's the credit checks as well as data security that the ones are the big ones.
Thank you. Andreas, would you like to add anything?
Well, there are a few things, I guess, and just from a recent example, you go through the RFP process and you speak about what you can do and what you can't, what you can agree to, what you can't agree to, and then the draft comes from the client, and everything you've discussed through the RFP process has been kind of set back to zero. And you have to start negotiating payment terms again, even though you've done it already. And all of these things and I'm not saying this is standard, don't get me wrong. Very often the client asks us to provide the first draft of the contract, and then we can put in what we've agreed. But it's procurement and legal's job to get, the 120 days payment terms on everything without interest, and and it's our job to fight back and say we can't do it and it's too much money and you're going to have to fund it, and but there are some deal breakers, exactly what Brian says, and I haven't experienced it yet, thank God, is if we were not to be able to comply with the computer with security, with the IT security requirements, and I understand that, and I would, if a company can't comply with that, then you can't comply with keeping a personal data safe and secure. Then there's, you're not going into too much detail about the actual contract negotiations, but that can in itself be another very long process for the RMC, for the simple reason that let me give you an example. I always find this exhausting. I mentioned payment terms, and you kind of spend weeks maybe or days negotiating payment terms, and then you finally come to payment terms and you agree, hallelujah, and you hug each other and we're all great, and then but we don't pay any late payment fees. And you go, well, hold on, why did we negotiate all of this? Committing, I mean, and this is just a tiny little example of how long it can take, and obviously, during that compliance session, I listened to that. I thought it was really interesting about insurance. That is something that we as a large RMC we can provide, but if we have to go to the supply chain and ask for for sometimes quite unrealistic insurance values and for scenarios that we just cannot cover, could theoretically be a deal breaker, but it hasn't. You always find common grounds, because what I've experienced is, and as long as it may take, even if you have to take the time to explain to your legal counterpart what we actually do, and how we do it, and then you find a lot of understanding. And oh, well, okay, that's fair enough.
Okay, good, thank you. Gemma, I'd like to come to you because I'm conscious of time and we're going to run out if we're not careful. So if, like I say, we've now negotiated the contract and we're moving forward to implementation, and supply chain are getting involved. Can you talk us through a little bit about your experience in terms of you're looking at the scope of work, if there has been a change in requirement from what was maybe initially agreed, and then how supply chain is brought into that process?
Yeah, certainly. And I think from a supply chain perspective, client implementation is probably the one area that we are most heavily involved in, and I think you definitely need a sort of strong internal relationships to see this process through. A lot of the times when we're discussing statement of work, which kind of comes under the umbrella of implementation, the contract may be awarded verbally, but we certainly don't necessarily have a client name on the paper. So there is still, very much to play here, and that is often why that kind of process is treated so confidentially. Sometimes we're under NDA with our clients. We can't talk to our network or even the wider business about that client name. So it's often a challenging process, and often why we may be, I suppose, a little bit secretive if we are reaching out to suppliers for, I don't know, more information or discussion around fees. I think there's two elements with the client implementation that I would probably like to focus on a little bit, which would be the statement of work and also the supplier selection piece. I I think when it comes to the statement of work, I think there can be a misconception or an assumption that a client signs up wholeheartedly to BDRS or an RMC's way of working and their scope of services. In many cases, that is absolutely true, especially if those clients have a robust, long-standing, centralized global mobility team who are empowered and aligned with their procurement team and that of the wider business. I think the reality, however, is that aligning on the statement of work is a process more often than not that takes a very long time. It can take months and months. I think the global mobility function today is at quite a critical juncture. I think they're having to expand on their own roles and responsibilities, their own positions within the wider organization. And I think a lot of that is frequently changing. And I think we feel that when it comes to the statement of work, and that can definitely be a journey of a winding road. It's never one straight road where things are signed and agreed easily and quickly. And I think it's really at this stage where, in terms of supply chain, we really do get quite heavily involved. It is a process that involves the global supply chain team, and definitely more than one of us, even within a regional perspective. It's also a process that involves client services, IT, tax, finance, legal. It's a pretty sort of heavy and robust piece of the whole RFP process. So when it comes to the statement of work, I think perhaps it's helpful to kind of create a picture. So you've gone through the sales have done their piece, the RFP has been sort of maybe verbally awarded. And it's at this point that we receive maybe a 6-page Word document complete with the global client locations and with details of all the activities being currently conducted in that existing scope. We often find, especially with decentralized clients, that countries are often doing their own thing independently of each other or applying client policies in completely different ways. It's up to supply chain and the implementation team to work through each of those countries and scenarios and essentially to find a way to convince those often local HR or global mobility contacts to sign up to essentially our way of working. And we try and match up as much as we can of their scope to ours. That obviously includes identifying where we do have a match and where we don't, and there are gaps. And we have to demonstrate how we can logically fill those gaps to service that client.
Yeah.
Not going to lie, it can be a very, very painful process and involves a lot of discussion. I think it's important for our audience that we to note that we do actively question clients over what they are doing or what they say that they need. And we try and figure out a way to reach an agreement without the need to go back out to our network or renegotiate fees with our suppliers. Essentially, we want to try and do the heavy lifting of this piece of work. We do make recommendations to clients, especially if we foresee or expect some issues around what they're currently doing and how we can match that up. Sometimes we do need to build some funky programs just to placate their clients, and maybe that is country specific. But we absolutely do so utilizing the information that we have to hand, using daily rates or maybe hourly rates, just to try and ensure that what we end up with is something that is clear, concise, and easily understandable from a supplier's point of view. It's also really important for us that we're trying to create and maintain a global consistency in the way the client policies are delivered and how that relates to our scope of service on the ground. Ultimately, from a supplier point of view, we want to ensure that by the time we go live with that client, what is required of them is crystal clear, and they're none the wiser to some of the challenges around the getting to that statement of work. So I suppose in summary, the statement of work piece of the client implementation is challenging for us. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that you're kind of trying to fit in with your scope with a little bit of tweak here and there, and maybe shoving that piece down a little bit harder just to make sure it fits nicely in the overall picture. And that can be a real delicate balance, especially it's with a client we haven't quite signed the contract with yet. And I think the second element of that is just the fact that it does involve heavy supply chain discussion, and we utilize the knowledge and expertise of the wider team to ensure that at the end of it, we have a statement of work that we can consistently and repeatedly deliver on. And the sort of second element to client implementation, which I think is probably most relevant, I guess, to our audience today, is the supplier selection piece. And this links very closely to the statement of work. So initially we would look at the client locations and typically align them to our primary providers within the network. These are then sent to the client for review. We identify who the client wants to keep, where, why, and we try and do that as early on in the process as we possibly can. Supplier selection is a real biggie, and it can take months to reach a final agreement on this process. So again, it's about filtering down that supplier matrix to the client on a local level, and we conduct a process called local gathering. So it's a bit of a spreadsheet that the local client fills out. So we want to understand the local norms, who the current local supplier is, what their relationships are, what are their local concerns, and we review those locations on a one-to-one basis. And again, this is a process that overall takes a very long time. I think one recent example we have had with a client we have implemented is we've had 60 individual client-specific country calls where we have had to join calls to talk about all those elements in that local on the local level to try and essentially convince those clients that we can do what they're doing better. We work, I think, within supply chain in any RMC, we work very hard with sourcing and managing our network of suppliers. We believe we are working with the best, so naturally we want any new client volume to go to our current and existing suppliers. So we do work very hard at trying to convince clients on the merit of that network. Sometimes that is an easy conversation. Sometimes it isn't and takes a long time. Sometimes we do need to bring those suppliers in, have those meet and greets, build the client confidence in terms of who we are, what we do, how we do it, and to sort of Andreas's earlier point, meet the people that ultimately are on the ground and going to be delivering those services. So it's kind of this stage where we do get probably a little bit more heavy involvement with our supplier partners. It is just about trying to convince the client that we know what we're doing and we can do it better than what they're doing today. So it's certainly a slow burner, and often we do not have the final supplier matrix signed until right before go live. So when it comes to supplier training on the client and the scope and their culture, we do leave it to the very last minute because it's very often that we're deciding on those final supplier names right up until that point. So it can be a bit of a fine line to get it all agreed, done and dusted in the time that we have available to us.
I think, sorry, just on that point, so on the client selected providers, I think that's a really interesting point, because I kind of completely understand why an RMC would want to use their network of chosen, carefully chosen providers in every country. On the other side, a DSP may have had a relationship locally with an organization for years, and that might know them really well, and maybe feel like they're being pushed to one side. So I guess also it's probably worth mentioning that hopefully there's an opportunity for RMCs to learn about other new providers that they may not have worked with before, who have been chosen for a very good reason by that client in a specific area. And so it can work both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have many examples actually where maybe the relationship with a supplier has started off as client directed, non-managed, and we've actually brought them into network in the end because they've done such a fantastic job. So it's not sort of all one way and not. And I think, where there are long-standing historic relationships, I think that's a valuable asset to any client or supplier to have. And we don't want to, come marching in and just disrupt and destroy everything that's happened in the past at all. I think it is about understanding on a local level what that is, what that means, and very much those suppliers can often bring a great deal of value to our own network. I think obviously with that they have to go through our own due diligence process, onboarding, and depending on sort of what that setup is, that again can take a long time. Sometimes those suppliers don't necessarily see the value of a due diligence process, which is complex and can take a long time for suppliers to go through. It's not necessarily painless at all. And some suppliers may welcome the change, some may begrudge the change. Obviously, we need to talk to those suppliers about the scope of service, how they're going to get initiated, how they're going to get paid, and that comes with a whole host of further training for them as well. So again, that's all part of this implementation process, and this is sort of another element that can really take a long time. But again, it's something that we can also, as an RMC, derive value from. And as I said, we have brought those suppliers into network because they've just done such a fantastic job. So it's definitely sort of two sides. It's never just one avenue, which again I think adds to the overriding complexity of an implementation.
Can I add just one little comment to that? And that is something that out of my experience from the sales side has also come along. Ultimately, though, this is the client's decision on the client suppliers. Something that I've experienced quite a lot is that you win an engagement and all sorts of suppliers contact you, which they of course they do, and it's normal, and they say they've been client directed and the client wants them. That has to come from the client, and because it's not our job to then go to the client. We'll ask the client, but it should be the best way for the local contact to filter that up to the decision makers to say, guys, we like your new RMC, we'll go with it, but we want to keep our destination service provider, language provider, or so on.
Absolutely. Okay, good. Thank you. Again, conscious of time, and I did think we'd probably be able to speak on a lot of these topics, probably each one of them for an hour, rather than trying to get through all of them. So I would like to finish with a couple of questions from the app, if that's okay. John, if you're backstage, John Harman, if you're backstage listening, we won't be long. We won't keep you long. I just want to ask a couple of questions. And they're good, actually. They're really good. There's lots of really good questions. We won't have time for all of them. So here's the first one. Andreas, let me maybe start with you. Let me put you on the spot and see what you think. Proposal professionals working in RMCs are no strangers to hard deadlines. However, these delivery dates can cause some proposals to be rushed and ultimately sacrifice quality. True or false?
True, 100% true. Sorry, is the question longer? Or did I just
No, it's true or false. I thought that was your answer. True.
It's a balance of, am I going to be the first one in whinge and say we need an extension to the deadline, or is somebody else, or is BGRS going to do that, or are we going to just power through and try to get this done as best as we can? I personally have no problem in asking for an extended deadline, but we get RFPs where we might only get a week's time, and that can be completely unrealistic, specifically if they're very specific with specific service delivery questions and models that they want that are different to what we normally do. But then there are others where we get 2 weeks and we actually respond early. So it happens a lot. And I know that sometimes we put a lot of pressure on the supply chain, our internal supply chain colleagues, and through that into the actual supply chain to get something in a ridiculous short amount of time. I know that, but what we do is we just have to pass it on what we get. And well, what we do, and I'm sure everybody else does that, is we don't sit on these questions for 3 days until we decide, we might have to ask supply chain. When we get an RFP, we look at it immediately and evaluate and see who needs the heads up right away, and so that these answers can be done in some sort of time. The worst ones are the household goods ones, where we get these outrageous spreadsheets with, I don't know, 30,000 rates that they need, and especially in times like these, which are completely irrelevant, the rates that we put in there, because tomorrow the freight rate's going to be 7 times as much. So, but and then you only get a week. I mean, that's a question of, do we want to give it a miss?
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you very much. Brian and Gemma, you were both nodding, so I'm not going to confirm that you would also have said true to that. Brian, here's a question for you. Which RFP is the easiest to understand and respond, driven by procurement, finance, HR, or mobility? Sorry, that's HR, mobility. So procurement, finance, HR, mobility.
Mobility, without a shadow of a doubt, I would say. I mean, we're all in the service industry. That's kind of really what we're here to do. Whilst finance obviously has a huge element to it, and the spend with it is obviously substantial, what we do is human, and we all can relate to it. So from someone that's got a mobility background, I think that's certainly the easiest thing for me to understand. Now, that's not to say that someone in procurement can certainly understand that. That's where I think to the points which we discussed before, Andreas, and sales teams, to the educational side of things, in terms of prior to submitting those for procurement people to really get a grasp of kind of what they're actually asking, and what Andreas is actually sending, and kind of the information that's within it.
Excellent, very good, thank you. Okay, Gemma, question for you, and I know this is a subject close to your heart. It says, talking sustainability, is having a large supply chain something to consider reducing? Having a large supply chain can be expensive, inefficient, and not sustainable. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on how we're defining sustainability. If it's sustainability in terms of having a supply chain that is robust, strong, and is going to, be around in 5-10 years time, or are we talking specifically about going green? Yes, supply chains are long, they are complex, but again, I think from an R&C perspective, it's about understanding your supply chain. It is about managing that network, building those relationships, understanding what our suppliers are doing, understanding what they can't do. Not everyone, if we are again sort of going towards the green side of sustainability, not everyone can implement changes. Not every country has robust emissions targets in place. Not every country has recycling processes in place. So we understand that certain elements can be restrictive. So again, I think from our perspective, it's about ensuring that we understand. So again, we can in turn educate our clients. It's also about understanding what suppliers are doing in terms of being able to talk about best practices. Sometimes somebody is doing something that someone else might have not thought of before, and I think it's important for us to be able to help our supply chains become more robust in that area and help guide them in terms of what our clients are looking for, because ultimately that's sort of where that need is being driven from. But I don't think it's necessarily in an easy one answer fits all area. And again, that's why supply chain management, I think, is so important, because we need to understand what challenges are facing our partners and how we can partner together to try and overcome them. We are essentially a supply chain is an extension of us, and we want our suppliers to be around. We want them to be successful. So I think it's about ensuring that those conversations are had in an open, honest, and transparent manner, so that we understand, what those difficulties are, and have a discussion around how we can help overcome those together, perhaps, and that's not necessarily always an easy task.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much. So we have overrun as predicted, so sorry, John, again. I'd like to say thank you very much to the three of you for taking the time to participate and the preparation that went in beforehand. I really appreciate how open and honest and forthright you've been with your responses, so thank you all very much. Susanna, if we hand back to you, and thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you for the Zoom drink in half an hour or so.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alistair, Gemma, Andreas, and Brian. What a wonderful insight. I think maybe some of us were not aware of the amount of time and effort that RMCs go through in order to secure new work from clients, which they then farm out to DSPs. I think this session has truly showed us the long process that RMCs go through securing new business and then handing it over to DSPs. I think DSPs have to ensure that the work is carried out in the best possible, timely, results-orientated, and in accordance with the client policies set out. I think true partnering here is key. So thank you for that, all of you. Now, last but not least, I'd like to welcome John Harman. John is the Global Account Manager at Court, representing Court Destination Services and the Court Global Network to the world of relocation. Today, John is going to discuss the stress and the assignee experience, or perhaps more relevant, the stress and the assignee experience of living through a global pandemic. In this session, John intends to be both honest and hopeful. Hi, John.
Thank you, Susanna. How nice to be introduced by a friend. And I should be. I don't know if you all can see my screen. If the slides are visible, there we go. All right. Thank you. And so I will say at the start, I will be on camera briefly at the beginning, and then we'll have only the slide deck, and I'll come back at the very end to say goodbye. I still haven't become accustomed to looking at myself while I present, and seeing myself looking back in the camera. And so excuse me for that, but I'll be here with you as we go through the slides. I did want to start where I might have ended otherwise in thanking EuRA. Just for the sake of time, I want to make sure we get this in. I want to thank EuRA for giving me the opportunity and the privilege really to be a part of the Spring Summit. I truly do appreciate it. And I also want to acknowledge the people at EuRA for pulling off this event. It's been terrific. I think clearly you've learned a lot on how to conduct an online event, and from the people behind the scenes to the people who did the planning. I absolutely think it's first rate. Every session I have attended has been professionally conducted and helpful. And so my hat's off to the team at EuRA for all that you've faced down, all that you've overcome, and all that you've achieved in the past year. It's been very difficult, and all of us as members are truly appreciative. So moving on, and goodbye. I'll see you after when my slides come up, when the slides are done. This is the slide that would have been my title slide, but I'll be honest, I couldn't think of a title for this session that didn't seem trite or formal. And I know that there's a title on the agenda, and Susanna alluded to the fact that I would talk about stress and the assignee experience, but I'm not really going to stick to that topic, not entirely anyway. When EuRA put out the call for speakers, I offered to do a talk on stress and the assignee experience, and I said I would work in some insights on stress and our experience of the pandemic. But as I worked on my slide deck and as I prepared for this session, I discovered that I just really felt like I had to change the focus. I felt like presenting a traditional conference session on something strictly work-related, it felt dishonest to me. It felt like to present about work as if nothing else was going on would dishonor the shared experience of the past year and all that is laid at our path. And so I felt like, truthfully, this moment called for more. And so here's my session without a title. I will talk about the science of stress, but I do so in the hopes that that science gives us a better understanding of ourselves and what we're going through and what people around us are going through, and hopefully allows us to approach this all with more compassion. So I really don't like this sign. I can say I hate this sign. This sign, or at least one exactly like it, appeared on a major street in the town where I live not long after the start of the initial lockdown. And it stayed there as the pandemic ebbed and surged. And it finally disappeared sometime during the winter in that overwhelming surge of cases and deaths that we all faced. And I drove by this sign almost every day just because of where it was. And I found myself fantasizing about ways to destroy the sign. I imagined buying a shotgun and blowing a hole in it. I imagined dousing it in lighter fluid and setting it on fire and dancing around the ashes. I imagined feeding it into a wood chipper. And I should explain, I don't like this sign because I think it's dishonest. I think it dishonors the experience of the pandemic. There's this concept of toxic positivity, and I think this is a perfect example of that. You can't. This sign is like putting a smiley face sticker on the empty gas gauge in your car and hoping that you won't run out of gas. There's some facts that we have to face and deal with, and the fact is that the pandemic is a global pandemic is difficult. Over the past 12 months, I've become suspicious of people who aren't willing or able to acknowledge that this has been a terribly difficult time, and that people who aren't willing to share that experience. It's people who are afraid to acknowledge that it's difficult, or somehow hiding or lying from the reality, and so I feel I can't trust them. I remember a few weeks after the pandemic was declared, I was on a walk with my children and a friend, and the kids started sharing their concerns about what the lockdown meant. They wouldn't be able to see friends, or they were going to miss somebody's birthday party, or they wouldn't be able to play basketball at recess, or whatever it was. They were sharing their fears honestly. There was a sense of loss and concern. And after a few minutes, my friend chirped in to say, yeah, it's going to be hard, but we're going to get through this. It's like she couldn't sit there with the reality that this was difficult. And I have to say, never once did it cross my mind, and I'm sure that's true of most of us, that we wouldn't somehow get through this. That's not the point. But when she chose the phrase "get through," she's automatically implying that there's going to be some difficulty. And in rushing past it and pointing to a happy ending, she was, in my view, denying the reality of the path we're on. You might say that my friend was under the spell of the first of three illusions that the poet David Whyte says or tells us we all share. And that first illusion is that we can somehow be immune to all the difficulties and ill health and losses that humanity has been subject to since the beginning of time. My friend was willing herself even past those difficulties. Reminding someone that positivity has not been canceled in the midst of a global pandemic is, like I said, it's like putting a smiley face sticker on the gas gauge of your car. No amount of smiling or encouraging words can hide the fact that life can be tremendously challenging. Now, in case you're curious about the other two illusions that David Whyte refers to, that they are the second, that you can construct a life in which your heart will not be broken, and the third, that you can somehow plan enough and arrange things just so that you'll be able to see down the path to the end of your life right from where you're standing with no obstacles or blind curves. And if anything, the pandemic has proven that that's impossible. So these illusions, they're dishonest. They're dishonest because they imagine a life where we might avoid difficulties or suffering, and we all know that's a lie. And so to start this session off, I wanted to acknowledge the simple but unavoidable truth that this has been hard. And I don't say this as a complaint. It's just simply a statement of fact, and not to acknowledge this fact would be to dishonor our experience. It's been hard in so many ways, and I think all of us recognize that the difficulties have been different for everyone. The hardships for a parent with school-age children are different from the hardships of a senior living through the pandemic isolated in a senior living center, are different from the hardships of a high school senior who's lost what should have been one of the most exciting years of their life, which are different from the hardships of a college graduate looking forward to starting their career and unable to do, which are different than the hardships of a poor family with 8 people in a 2-bedroom apartment struggling to find a way through the pandemic. And now we have the hardships of those in India and Latin America who are facing a spike in cases when we had all hoped we might be moving on. Or even worse, the hardships of those who are living through the pandemic while in a country that's caught up in an international conflict. And so I feel like I could spend the entire session acknowledging what has been suffered, almost like reading the names of those lost at a war memorial. But suffice it to say that this has been hard. And in confessing that fact, we honor the experience. And the truth is, this is hard because it's certainly not over yet. So I did say I would talk about stress, and as I said, I want to approach the stress from the sense of what we can learn from it in order to be more compassionate to ourselves and others. So we might start by asking the question, what is stress? Stress is a word we use all the time, but I think many of us would struggle to come up with a specific definition. If you look at this image, is the stress the pressure of the hand outside the gentleman, or is it the little guy, or is it what he's experiencing internally as a result of that pressure? And sort of the modern medical sense of what stress is came from this Hungarian researcher who was working in Canada. His name's Hans Selye. And he came up with a definition of the internal changes, the stress response inside the body. He called it general adaptation response, which is the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. Meaning, non-specific meaning it may be more increased heart rate and adrenal function this time and more cortisol and shutting down the digestive system next time, but there's a certain pattern within the body of systems that are impacted by this experience of an external stressor. And I think the word that you'll find when you look at research on stress over and over and over again coming up is this word change. There's been a tremendous amount of research pointing to the impacts of change and relating it to stress. You know, there's the work of Thomas Holmes and Richard Ray, who actually looked at people who are having significant health issues and asked them about the life change that they were going through in the time leading up to their illness. And lo and behold, no surprise to us, their research pointed to the fact that major life changes are stressful. But then not long after came this guy, Alan Kanner, came along, he was at Berkeley. And of course, there's plenty of other research. I've just chosen these two examples. And Alan Kanner looked at Holmes and Ray's work and he said, yeah, major life change is stressful, but you know what stresses me out is daily hassles, like a partner who snores or a roommate who's sloppy or getting a flat tire. And he did his research and lo and behold, he found out that day-to-day hassles are stressful as well. And so what you find is that moving, because, you know, I typically talk about stress as it relates to moving. Moving is major life changes combined with a whole lot of hassles, and it really adds up to a stressful experience. But if you think about it, the same is true of the pandemic. We've all experienced tremendous life changes and all kinds of different interruptions or disruptions to our day-to-day living on a small scale that add up to be hassles, and the experience has been no doubt stressful. Now, I want to speak also to a new model for understanding the brain that can help us understand our experience of the assignee and, of course, the experience of the pandemic as well. We've all been taught of the brain as a stimulus response machine where, you know, it's just sitting there waiting for inputs, and it sees an image or smells a smell or hears a sound, and somebody says a word and the stimulus comes in and the brain generates a response. The new thinking about the brain, whether it's neuroscientists or philosophers of the brain, is that the brain is actually more of a prediction correction machine. And it's really fun to look at the brain this way. And it helps us, and I think as I go through some examples of what it means in real life, you'll see it makes a lot of sense. And it's actually much more useful and realistic than the concept of stimulus response. So our brain is constantly running these streams, these cascades of predictions based on the input that's coming in. And in an effort to sort of sense what's going to happen next and predict really at the base level the best way to keep us alive, the best way to respond. And so what this looks like is there are three sources of input that the brain gets, because the brain is just encased in darkness. It's an organ in a dark box, the skull, and it relies on information from the outside, whether it's changes in air pressure or touch, light, chemicals, sound, smells. Information is also coming from inside the body. It's aches, body sensations, guts, nausea, butterflies in our stomach. And it's referencing those two sources of stimuli or information against the information it has from our life experience. And based on those, it's making a prediction. And so to show you some sort of real life examples that will help this explanation of the new understanding of the way the brain function works, you look at this image. And most of you probably initially, if you're like me, some of you may not, but most of you at first glance will see a giraffe on a savanna, at least hopefully a few of you. I know that's what I saw the first time because, and if you look more closely, you pull out the details, and after that initial quick judgment, you realize, oh, that's not a giraffe, that's not a savanna, that's actually two children, maybe two boys preparing to do a handstand or a cartwheel on a beach. But the thing is, the brain has seen far, far more images of the outline of a giraffe and the shape of a giraffe on a savanna than it has seen of boys preparing to do a handstand on the beach. And so if you go back and you think about the experience that the brain is cross-referencing, sorry for that, the image against, that experience will initially say, this is a giraffe standing on a savanna, because that's what those images mean to our brain most frequently. We've all had the experience of standing on a train in a station, and while our train remains stationary, the train next to ours starts to move. And our body lurches as if our own train were moving. And again, the brain sees motion through the window as movement of the vehicle you're on. And so it predicts you're moving, and it triggers a response where you sort of try to catch your balance, even though the train you're on hasn't moved at all. Again, that's a prediction. It's an incorrect prediction, but it's the brain making predictions. We really only notice the predictions when they're wrong, and that's what many optical illusions are. But there are other ways that this prediction shows up as well. The predictive brain shows up in close friendships where we can finish each other's sentences, or we can just look at each other and start to laugh because we know what the other person is thinking based on our years and years and years of experience of interacting with them. Or in fact, and the truth is the brain is actually very good at predicting. In fact, right now, your brain is predicting the next word that will come out of my mouth. And it does that based on all the times that you've heard people speak the English language. The predictions may not be as accurate for those of us for whom English is not our native language. The question arises, what if we have no relevant experience? So we're getting input from life, sensations from our body, images, sounds from the outside world, but our brain doesn't have anything to reference us against. That the concept, the idea there, they call that experiential blindness, right? So, and you can start to imagine the amount of experiential blindness that an expat experiences on an assignment. But I would say that from this day, which was March 11th, when the WHO declared a pandemic, we were all thrown into a world in which we were experientially blind. We didn't know to predict. How many of us thought it would be over in a few weeks or a few months and it wouldn't be such a big deal? How many of us, we didn't know what we were headed for? We were going to learn terms that we'd never spoken before. We were going to understand stuff about epidemics that we didn't know. And even the epidemiologists were largely working from models and not real life experience. So there was so much to learn. We were sort of awash in experiential blindness. And think about medical workers who had to work under conditions with a disease they weren't familiar with, under conditions that they had never experienced before. Or if you look at the chart of the sort of spread and growth of the pandemic, you have to wonder, now that we've all been this, and God willing, we'll never go through this again in our lifetimes, but if we did, would our experience of having lived through a global pandemic change the outcome of the way it spread? And would the graph look different because we wouldn't be blind, but we'd have experience with which or against which to reference this new pandemic? And many of us have probably experienced this form of experiential blindness during the pandemic. How many times have we thought it was almost over, thought that we saw the light at the end of the tunnel, only to be surprised and see more difficulties and changes come across? So we can add to the stress of change and the daily hassles the experience of experiential blindness. So when our predictions are wrong, we have a word for, and we have a new experience, we call that learning, right? That's how learning takes place. In fact, Einstein says learning is experience. Everything else is just information. I've had to learn as a parent to use less words and to allow my children to experience life, because there's not much my words have to offer them unless they have real life experience against which to reference it. And so otherwise, I'm just making the air move, you could say. The thing about learning, which we've all been doing throughout the pandemic, and as we make these prediction errors and we learn new things based on our experience, is learning is metabolically expensive. In the words of Daniel Levitin, who wrote The Organized Mind and This Is Your Brain on Music, neurons are living cells. They have a metabolism. They need oxygen and glucose to function. And when they've been working hard, we experience fatigue. So you ever wonder why toddlers need so many naps? Yes, they're physically growing, but they're also mentally growing. When you're this young, every day is filled with new experience. And how many of us have found ourselves more tired as we work our way through the pandemic? Yes, some of it's the change and the stress and the hassles that we're facing, but it's also just the amount of learning that we're going through and the amount of change we've had to adapt to. Some of you may have seen me talk about the SCARF model as it pertains to the assignee experience. This gentleman, David Rock, has written a book called This Is Your Your Brain at Work. And in it, he introduces the SCARF model. And he says that the brain responds particularly strongly to stimulus in these 5 social domains, whether it's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And especially when there are threats in these areas, the brain becomes very active. Certainty stands out as something that the pandemic may have triggered. There's been tremendous uncertainty. We like to know what's coming next. And when we don't, it's a source of stress and it drains our energy. And then finally, so we've talked about life change, daily hassles, experiential blindness and prediction error, and the learning that comes as a result of that. We talked about the amount of uncertainty we're living with. And finally, as pertains to the pandemic experience, there's this gentleman, Bruce Perry. He's an MD and a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist and a researcher, and he does a lot of work with traumatized children who've had early childhood trauma. And he has introduced a concept called relational poverty, which in his view was an issue, an epidemic in the United States anyway, even before the pandemic came along. So relational poverty is a deep lack of connectedness with others that we all need to survive and be well. You sort of pause there, and you can imagine where I'm going. Here's some charts he uses. These are actually his slides. And I'm going to read to you from the research paper that these were a part of so you can understand what we're looking at. These charts show positive relational interactions. And the first chart on the left, the yellow slide, is a typical child, and the one on the right is a foster child. These two figures are representative of 24 hours of relational contact maps examining the positive relational interactions in two children. So you'll notice at the top of the slide it says 24, that's midnight. And then the right hand is 6 o'clock in the morning. And as you move around as the day goes on, you'll see most of the interactions are taking place during the daylight hours. And of course, there aren't really any during the night. Each line, well, let me keep going. Arrows represent, or lines represent, positive interactions as rated by an observer and by the child. Lines ending in the inner circle represent interactions with family. Additional circles represent friends, then classmates and acquaintances. Lines reaching outside the circle represent interactions with strangers. The figure on the right is based on a 10-year-old boy in foster care who was moved in the middle of the school year to a new foster home away from extended family and community. This figure is the best 24-hour map from a 2-week period for this child. So this was his best day of positive interactions. Several days were completely devoid of any positive relational interaction. The relational poverty played a major role in this child's inability to progress. Symptoms related to trauma and neglect persisted and increased while he was relationally impoverished settings. Once in a stable placement with positive relationships created in school and community, he stabilized and improved. And so it doesn't take a lot of imagination. We might want to ask ourselves, what would our version of a table like this look like during our experience of the pandemic and the social isolation? And I do believe it really would be different for everybody. I was on the phone with a client yesterday who's single and lives in London and says that, if she doesn't go out to the shops if she didn't go out to the shops during the peak of the lockdown, she could go days without a direct personal interaction with another person. And so her chart would look different than mine, which would have a ton of lines on the inner green circle, because my family's been in the house together for this whole time and interacting so much. Not all of them would show up as positive, I know, but certainly there's been far more interaction in the inner circle than reaching into the outer circle. And all of these interactions are valuable. Even the smile and a quick funny word or a joke with a stranger in line at the grocery store is a positive experience, or is a positive interaction. And our days were built of these interactions, and it was all taken away. So we can add to the change and the hassles and the stress-related, experience, or the experiential blindness of the pandemic and the tremendous uncertainty we've been dealing with. So this social isolation, we've been going through one of the hardest times of our lives at a distance, all over the world, wherever we are, facing and dealing with this tremendous change and stress, largely in isolation. So pandemic living is major life changes, daily hassles, tremendous uncertainty, frequent prediction error in learning, and relational poverty. And it's been hard. Now, I do hopefully have a few more slightly encouraging words. I'd like to reframe our understanding of stress, if I might, in this way. First of all, when you see stress research, you need to take it with a grain of salt, right? We all hear all kinds of bad news or information about stress in the media, but the truth is research reveals probabilities, which are then presented as facts, especially by the media, who want to generate headlines and make us scared or nervous or get us to buy their publication. This headline isn't stress related, but honestly, do we really think eating enough curry is the key to preventing dementia? I mean, can you imagine sitting with your doctor, getting a dementia diagnosis, and having the doctor say, if you'd only had 13 more curries, we wouldn't be here right now. And yet, the headline appears in a major publication and has the potential to cause stress or concern for us. So, the first thing I'd encourage in this regard is that we all stop buying, reading, or looking at magazines such as these. They underestimate us, they patronize us, they're there to generate profit and not specifically to help us. Look at the claims made on the cover of this center magazine. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. It's a bit of a pet peeve for mine. This single monthly publication is claiming that it's going to help you rebuild confidence after you've lost your job, avoid a midlife crisis, reconnect with society, discover bliss by the sea, as if we need to read a magazine article to know how to do that, get rid of our anxiety, find calm in 7 steps. Wow, 7 steps. I wonder where they got the 7 steps. I saw one that was 6 in another magazine. They're going to teach us how to be a good enough parent. They're going to help us create a whole new world for ourselves in life after lockdown. And oh yes, they're going to help us fall in love again and break our unhealthy patterns. See, these magazines take that type of research and publish it in a way as if they could create some shortcut to make our lives better. And the truth is, they underestimate us. We underestimate ourselves if we pick them up and read them, because just focusing on the calm one, each and every person sitting here listening to this call knows what it takes to help you be calm. Maybe you knit, maybe you go for a walk, maybe you have tea with your best friend, but you don't need a magazine article to help us figure out how to be more calm or how to handle the stress of the pandemic necessarily and do things that are good for us. The question is not what to do, it's why don't we allow ourselves to do it more? Truthfully, how helpful is this publication to someone who's living a life that matches this graph or map? So I encourage you to take research with a grain of salt. The other thing to consider is that our mindset in relationship to stress does matter. This lady, Ellen Langer, is brilliant. She's the first lady tenured in the psychology department at Harvard University, and she's written some tremendous book, including Mindfulness, which I know is a sort of a buzzword these days, but it's a book she wrote in the 1980s. And she points out that stress is not a function of events, but a function of our view of those events. You know, even William James, the father of American psychology, said over 100 years ago, our greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over the other. And so we do have some agency. And even Hans Selye started to feel bad about the bad press that stress was getting and perhaps the additional stress it was causing people. So he came up with this concept of eustress, which is good stress. It's stress in the sense that our response to a stressor creates a sense of meaning, hope, and vigor. It's uncomfortable, but it leads to growth. And that whole concept was taken up by Kelly McGonigal, who's a psychiatrist at Stanford University, in her book, The Upside of Stress, where she points to the fact that challenges lead to growth, whether it's the challenging our muscles that leads to muscle growth, or the challenging our brain with effortful recall and learning to express new ideas in writing and verbally that leads to learning, or the challenges we face in the pursuit of a life goal, or the rewards and challenges of meeting our greatest difficulties or problems at work and solving them, the challenge of caring for an elderly parent or being a parent ourselves. All of these experiences are stressful, but I don't think any of us would wish them away because we know they help form who we are and they're a part of who we become in the world. You know, the idea, you could think of the feeling of stress as an indicator that what you're up against or what you're facing actually matters to you. And in that sense, stress can be enhancing. So there is more to the story of stress, and the more to the story is us. It's how we respond, right? Even in the face of the pandemic, we do have some agency. The choices we make on a daily basis have the power to mitigate the effects of stress on our mental and physical well-being. We're not at the end of this yet, and the lingering effects of the past 14 months are going to take some time to overcome. You know, a vaccine isn't a pandemic off switch with the power to make our lives go back to what they were. As someone who's vaccinated, I can tell you that. It's going to take time. And I want to be clear, what I'm saying here is not that our part is to work out more or eat healthy or get lots of sleep or start a medication practice. What we need to do is, it's less a matter of willpower and more a matter of grace, you know, the grace we need to show ourselves. We need to expect less of ourselves and give ourselves a break. It has to be okay that we're more tired and less productive. The whole point of sharing this information on stress, like I said, is to help us get a sense of just what we've been up against and hopefully to allow ourselves to direct some compassion back towards ourselves. You know, if a friend were to call us and say they were feeling overwhelmed or exhausted by their pandemic life, what advice would we give them? I doubt any of us would tell them to buck up, go for a run, clean the house, and get on with it. And we need to show ourselves the same compassion that we would show a friend. So I mentioned at the start of the session that I had lost my patience for people who were not willing to share honestly about the difficulty of pandemic life. And the truth is, the thing that has kept me sane, really more than anything else through these past 14 months, has been honest conversations with friends about who we'd become in the face of the pandemic. These conversations usually revealed a shared experience, and they made me feel less alone. And in hopes that maybe one of you might feel less alone, let me share with you. In the past 14 months, I had more to drink than I'm accustomed to. I've eaten more, and I've eaten at unusual hours not typically reserved for eating. I allowed my workout routine to melt away. My sleep regimen is anything but a regimen. The only thing that is certain is that at some point in the night, I will go to bed. And too often, I've allowed my children to adopt a similar approach to bedtime. I've lost my patience with my children more than I would like to admit. My wife and I have struggled to stay close. We're committed to finding a way through, but it has not been easy. I've permitted my children to indulge far more screen time than we've been accustomed to. And more than once, when my wife has asked me how long a child has been playing a certain video game, I've responded, I don't know, and I really don't care. On 3 separate occasions, let me try to do this, I found myself crying for no apparent reason. Just last Thursday, I dropped my children off at school, and the minute I put the car in reverse to back out of the parking lot, the tears started flowing. I cried the whole drive home, and I couldn't for the life of me explain why. I still can't. For every item on this brief and incomplete list, I have spoken to someone, many someones, whose experience has been the same. And in sharing and listening, I felt less alone, and I hope that they felt the same way. You know, when there wasn't a friend to talk to, I sometimes found solace in a column in the New York Times where the paper invited people to share about their experience of the pandemic. I saw myself in the experience of these strangers, and again, it made me feel less alone. And in one of the columns, they invited teens across the country to share works of art that they had created in response to the pandemic. You know, I had a writing teacher once who said, if you're really lucky, someday you'll write something, you know, either a story that someone will read or a movie that they'll go to and then walk out of, and they'll turn to somebody who watched the movie with them and they'll say, you know, life is like that. And that's what you're striving for as an artist. And I think that's what these children have accomplished. And so I wanted to share with you some of the work. Hannah Blue is 17. She lives in Dallas, and she actually created a tarot deck of pandemic life, a tarot deck for the pandemic. You can see, you know, confinement has a bird in a cage, or that black soul wrapped in chains of social isolation, internet addiction. Rebecca Wong wrote about how the arrival of the pandemic just brought to light the anti-Asian or the Asian racism against Asians that she experienced on a daily basis and made it more visible. Evelyn Cox wrote about how social isolation was good for her. It helped her learn more about herself and face up, you know, deal with some of her social anxiety, and she feels a better person for having been able to spend more time alone. Aisha Musa shared this text exchange, and I'm sorry if you can't read it, but she's out with her father at the grocery, and she's asking her sister how to put the mask on over her hijab, and her sister has to tell her first the mask, then the hijab. And she wrote about how it's still hard to remember to put the mask on first. Paloma Esset wrote about how hard it was to be a normal high school student in the pandemic, and how she and her classmates showed up and tried anyway. Camilla Salinas wrote about how strange it was to show up and be the only person in a classroom when they had the option to return from virtual learning, and so many chose to stay at home. Ryan Daniel made this picture of his little sister trying to represent how confined she felt as the pandemic started, but he also wrote about how close they became because of the amount of time they spent together. Haven Hutchinson was entering his senior year in high school, and he and his friends were looking forward to the best summer of their lives. And he wrote about how one of his best memories of the summer was driving separately with 4 friends to a parking lot and sitting in the back of their cars and just talking for 4 hours at a safe distance. And then Chloe Kim said the following, and I'll read what she said. She said, when we first went into lockdown, it felt like an extension of spring break. We laughed about the toilet paper shortage of 2020. We believed COVID-19 would disappear soon. I remember the first couple of weeks thinking this was my chance to become stronger during quarantine and get a glow up. I did YouTube workouts and workouts our coaches posted. I did much self-care and focused on myself. But as time went on, online school started and the climbing season got canceled. I lost motivation and started falling into an unhealthy hole. My sleep schedule was non-existent and I rarely got out of my bed, even for classes. I completely lost any desire to continue working out or do any self-care. I also stopped contacting my friends, which left me feeling alone and weak. I felt like I was in this by myself and no one could help me. This picture signifies me finding my rhythm and becoming happier and finding a way to climb out of this hole and overcome my downward spiral. You know, as much as we want to disparage young people, I would say that in their words and in their art, this group has represented their generation with the dignity and resilience to which we might all aspire. The pandemic took away the touchstones that Chloe relied upon to help her navigate life, and it left her at the bottom of a deep, dark canyon. And so here she is climbing out of the abyss. And in that climb, and in finishing that climb, she will encounter herself again. But the self that she encounters will not be the same as the person who started the pandemic trying to work out more and get a glow up. The person who climbs out will be different than the person who was dropped to the canyon floor. And that's because that is the way of difficulty. It changes us. It becomes a part of who we are. We didn't ask to be placed at the bottom of the dark canyon. Life put us there. We are, all of us, on the path that Chloe took, pulling ourselves up the face of the cliff that we didn't ask to climb. And when we get to the top and we return to ourselves, we will find that we have changed. What else could we do? What is resilience if not responding to ourselves? What is resilience if not returning to ourselves after a hardship? And so when we gather in Seville next year, we will be a different group than the group that met in Munich. We'll be better, and we'll see it in each other, and we will know it to be true. I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you in Seville.
Wow, John, what a way to end the Spring Summit. Thank you for sharing this with us. As always, the topics chosen are absolutely fascinating, relevant, and especially in these times. Well, we're now coming to the close of the summit, but before I go, there are a couple of things I'd like to say. Firstly, all of you know Minnie by now, because he's been with EuRA for a long, long time. If I'm not mistaken, Minnie has been by our side since our 10th anniversary in Rome. Minnie, I want to thank you on behalf of the EuRA board for the hard work throughout all these years with the tech setup. Without you, we'd be truly stuck, especially through these times where everything is so virtual. So thank you very much. The next thing I'd like to do is to thank each and every one of you for being here with us, as I know that people have been joining from all around the globe, taking time from your busy agendas. I also want to say thank you to all the speakers, both within the industry and out, for the time, comments, opinions, expertise, truly inspirational. Now, finally, I invite you all to go back into the agenda of the Wover app and click on the Zoom link to meet the board. I know that Tad, Dom, and the rest of the team are all there waiting for you. If not, I think you should have received also an email with the link, so you could go that way too. So all I have to say is bye-bye for now, and until we meet again.